In June 1990, Universal Studios Florida officially opened, inviting guests to learn about the secrets of movie making through high-intensity, special effects-laden thrill rides. And the centerpiece of Universal's Florida expansion was a ride named Kongfrontation, a dark ride, taking guests high above New York, culminating in a face-to-face encounter with the legendary movie monster King Kong. A spectacular attraction in the park, and an incredible technological achievement at the time, with two of the largest animatronics ever created for a theme park ride. Kongfrontation, though, is also an attraction that holds a great deal of historical significance for Universal. In a way, the reason for being for the company's whole Florida expansion in the first place. Remarkably, I've not yet made a video about Kongfrontation, so I'd like to change that, and take a look back at the history of this deeply impressive ride, the equally ambitious predecessor that sparked its creation, the troubles of its opening, its eventual closure, and the legacy that King Kong leaves behind today. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, you'll know that, like most major attractions from the early days of Universal, the story of Kongfrontation actually begins over in California, on the world-famous Universal Studios Tram Tour. In 1986, the Universal Studio Tour in Hollywood opened the most ambitious attraction in its history. The Tram Tour of Universal's backlot sets had included custom special effects demonstrations and theme park-style mini-attractions along its route since the 1960s. And now, the latest stop on the tour would be an indoor segment featuring one of cinema's most recognizable monsters, King Kong. After visiting the outdoor New York Street part of the backlot, the tram would enter a soundstage, where guests would find more New York streets at night, reminiscent of the city in the year 1976, the same year as the release of the most recent remake of King Kong. The tram would travel slowly across a bridge, stopping outside an apartment building, where, through the windows, guests could see a TV news report about a beast rampaging through the city. The report would then go live to a reporter named Kelly King, flying in a helicopter, reporting on a derailed train destroyed by the creature. As she was giving her report, she would then spot the tram on the bridge below her, and attempt to warn the guests about the danger they were in. But before she could, she would spot something else off camera, and the transmission would cut, and in front of the tram, her helicopter would come crashing down, engulfed in flames. The tram would then move around the corner to find the derailed train, and more destruction on the street below the bridge. A police helicopter would fly overhead, and as the tram continued forwards, the guests would run directly into the path of King Kong, an enormous animatronic clinging to the side of the bridge, shaking the tram up and down and roaring ferociously towards the tourists as they made their escape out of the soundstage to continue the rest of the tour. The King Kong segment, most commonly referred to as King Kong Encounter, was far and away the new highlight of the entire studio tour. It had taken Universal 2 years to create, at a cost of $6.5 million, making it the most expensive addition the tour had seen up to that point. More than 6 times as expensive as the last most expensive edition, built 7 years earlier. The art director and one of the lead designers for the project had been former Disney Imagineer Peter Alexander, and the King Kong animatronic itself had been designed by Sequoia Creative, a company also made up of former Disney Imagineers, including legendary designer Bob Gurr. The animatronic was the attraction's most striking element, a 30-foot tall recreation of King Kong, capable of 29 separate movements. As he roared at guests, his breath would even smell of bananas. The pedigree of its designers, and the massive sum of money Universal had pumped into the project, had paid off, as that year's addition to the tour was a huge success, increasing visitors from 3.5 million a year to 4.5. And according to an article written by Peter Alexander, Kong was such a success that it would cause Universal to return to another, even more ambitious plan they had abandoned earlier that decade. In 1982, Universal had entertained the idea of building a second version of the studio tour in Orlando, Florida, not too far from the country's biggest tourist destination, Walt Disney World. To be a tourist attraction first, a movie studio second, focusing on all of those mini attractions from the original tour, including an early design of King Kong Encounter. In addition to the tour, the Florida site would have also contained a collection of rides and shows in the front half of the park to turn the new location into Universal's first purpose-built theme park. The Florida park plans had been quietly shelved not long after, but with the success of Kong, Universal thought that perhaps they weren't such a bad idea after all. However, in 1987, Universal would learn that Disney were working on a suspiciously similar tram tour theme park hybrid to open in 1989 at Disney World. And so, eager to outcompete the theme park giant, Universal would modify their Florida plans. The tram tour was scrapped, and instead those mini attractions from Hollywood would be expanded into fully fledged, standalone theme park rides, to open at the new park to be named Universal Studios Florida. Naturally, the centerpiece of this new ride-based theme park would have to be an expanded version of the attraction that had brought Universal so much success in the first place. And in 1988, work began on a new, even more impressive version of King Kong Encounter to be named Kongfrontation. Every part of Kongfrontation had to be bigger than in Hollywood. In order to set the new version of the ride apart from its original, Kongfrontation's ride vehicle would become a Roosevelt Island aerial tram. An idea inspired by a scene in the Sylvester Stallone movie Nighthawks, in which the New York tram car is hijacked. With Kongfrontation also taking place in New York, the Roosevelt Island tram fit perfectly with the King Kong theme. The new ride vehicle, suspended from the ceiling, would take guests higher above the New York sets than the trip across the bridge in Hollywood, and would hopefully increase the thrill factor, as guests would be far more exposed to King Kong. The King Kong animatronic that would serve as the focal point of the ride would also be much larger than in Hollywood, growing from 30 to 37 feet tall, and with an expanded range of movement, with 62 possible functions. And to really make it clear that this was the definitive version of the attraction, there would be two of them, as the plan for the ride was that guests would initially escape from King Kong near the bridge, but would run into him again for the ride's finale. Also planned for the finale was a complicated effect where King Kong would appear to pick up the tram and drop it, sending riders falling out of the sky. Ride manufacturer Aerodynamics were tasked with creating the ride system, as construction began on the 6-story show building. 50 individual 1970s New York facades were built on the show floor, and the tracks of the Roosevelt Island tram were placed overhead. And after 2 years of development, Universal's bigger and better King Kong ride was ready to open. On June 7th, 1990, Universal Studios Florida held its grand opening. The park had been beaten to the punch by a year by Disney's movie studio park, Disney MGM Studios. But aside from its copycat tram tour, that park held very few actual rides, and Universal was hopeful that what they had to offer was about to blow Disney out of the water. Extended versions of Hollywood's Jaws and Earthquake attractions, shows about the secrets of movie making, a not yet seen in Hollywood dark ride themed to the movie E.T., yes, a small tram tour, and in the New York section of the park, Kongfrontation. Guests would enter the ride through a large facade of New York's Penn Station. Kongfrontation would choose to frame its story as happening on a movie set, where guests were actors filming a scene rather than genuine victims of King Kong. This movie studio theme would become apparent as guests entered the building to see plywood and soundproof padding typical of a soundstage, before rounding the corner to enter onto set. From here, they would find themselves in the ride's queue, where they'd been transported to New York City in 1976, and they would walk through the corridors of a fictional subway station in Manhattan. The station was grimy and covered in graffiti, with advertising on the walls accurate to the era, including ads from the ride's sponsor, Texaco, a sponsor that would come in handy for the many special effects guests were about to experience. Also in the station, overhead TV monitors would introduce the ride's story, playing a news report from WWOR-TV Channel 9, a real news station in New York City. The news report was fictional, but it was read by then current WWOR anchor Roland Smith, who also replaced the previous anchor in the TV segment in Hollywood. Smith would report that King Kong had escaped from his captors and was loose on the streets of Manhattan, and the report would be intercut with shots from the movie. The news report would also be accompanied by an emergency broadcast, further warning of Kong's escape, and advising that all nearby civilians head to the Roosevelt Island trams to be evacuated from Manhattan. Turning the corner, guests would then exit the subway station onto the nighttime streets of Manhattan and head up a ramp of the Roosevelt Island tramway station. Across from them, they could see facades of storefronts and apartment buildings, the streets deserted as New Yorkers evacuated. At the top of the ramp, they would arrive at the ride's loading station, where they could board their ride vehicle, a 32-person tram, in its iconic red livery, with a Universal team member in the front playing a tram operator. And with the tram loaded, guests would attempt their escape from Manhattan to begin the ride. Riders would travel high in the air at the top of the large show building, looking down onto the city below and the destruction already caused by King Kong. In the ride vehicle, speakers would play police radio chatter, providing updates on the rampage, and the team member would communicate back and forth with the pre-recorded police audio. In the first scene, they'd see general disarray and a burst fire hydrant spraying water high into the air, but their guide would assure them that Kong was heading away from the tram. Almost immediately, the situation would change, and the radio would demand all trams to stop because Kong was now heading straight for them. The panicked team member would tell guests that the tram was stuck in automatic, and next to them, a power line would spark and burst into flames. Below, they'd see an ambulance lying on its side in the street, next to a burning, derailed train. And on the wall of a nearby building, a helicopter spotlight would reveal the silhouette of Kong, his roar echoing in the distance. The radio would announce that Kong was now heading for the Queensboro Bridge, the bridge the Roosevelt Island tram follows in real life, and turning right to enter the next scene, guests would see the bridge ahead of them. A pretty large-scale model, elevated slightly above their eyeline to increase its apparent size. Hanging from it would be King Kong, the first of the two animatronics, with its larger scale and its increased movement. On the other side of the ride vehicle, a police helicopter would announce that it was going to fire on Kong, and the team member would scramble to warn them not to shoot. The helicopter would shoot anyway, but miss, and an enraged Kong would retaliate by attacking the tram. Here, the aerodynamics ride vehicle would reveal its secret effect, as it would suddenly shake and drop a few feet as if Kong had hit it. An effect achieved through a bellows-like system on top of the car itself, allowing it to move vertically as it was going along the ride track. In the chaos, the helicopter would fall out of the sky, exploding into a fireball on the Queensboro Bridge. The tram, though, would survive the encounter, and leave the first animatronic behind, crossing the East River. An actual stream of water in the ride building, guests could just about make out below, as the team member assured them their station was only a little bit further. Around one last corner, guests would head into the ride's final scene, as the light from another helicopter would shine directly at them, obscuring their vision of what was ahead. As the light went away, they would be surprised with the second Kong animatronic. Now on the right of the tram, face to face once again, its banana breath filling the ride vehicle. King Kong was so close, guests could almost touch him. And in fact, the team member's script would always remind guests at this point to keep their hands and arms inside the vehicle. As they did, Kong would mount another attack, this time his arm coming down to create the illusion that he was picking up the tram, and the vehicle would lift higher into the air. The second police helicopter would seize the opportunity to shoot at King Kong, and yet more pyrotechnic effects would go off, causing him to drop the tram. The guests would fall out of the sky further than before, almost hitting the ground, but the team member would regain control and move them to safety. Guests had successfully made their escape from King Kong, and TV monitors inside the ride vehicle would play an updated news report detailing their escape, featuring actual ride footage of the guests themselves, taken from hidden cameras within the building. Lastly, they would pass a large ad on a wall for Texaco, thanks Texaco, and pull back into the unload station. Guests would then leave the New York set and head into the attraction's gift shop, where they would find a photo opportunity with a model King Kong, before heading back into Universal Studios to end their experience of Kongfrontation. Kongfrontation had a very basic layout, and at its core it was a very simple idea. It was just a slow-moving circuit through the building, first showing off an animatronic on the left and then on the right. Even the presence of the helicopter in both scenes made them kind of mirror one another. But the level of detail in its theming and special effects made the 5-minute ride an incredibly impressive experience. There were a ton of other atmospheric effects and more general details that I didn't mention. Smoke rising from the derailed train, headlights from cars teetering over the edge of the bridge, more sparks raining down from power lines. There were even rooms visible inside the apartment buildings the ride vehicle would pass. The helicopters were often not filmed, given most tourists were more concerned with something else in the room, but they too were impressive props. And I've already mentioned the clever forced perspective of the Queensboro Bridge. The ride vehicle's up and down movement, allowing it to simulate being picked up, is to my mind very similar to Disney's enhanced motion vehicle that wouldn't appear for another 5 years. And the entirety of the queue, particularly the facades of more New York buildings just out of reach of guests, created this impression of a much wider world beyond the confines of the show building that did a great job of selling the realism of the ride. And that's all while barely making mention of the King Kong animatronics themselves, now even larger and more complex than the single Hollywood one, maintaining and improving upon the up-close meeting with even more interactivity. It's naturally always going to be difficult to tell when it comes to long-gone attractions, but even today, I think these animatronics would still be regarded as some of the most impressive in theme parks. There were some limitations with its design and storytelling, mainly the fact that the load and unload station were in the same spot, unlike similar Universal rides which had an unload station concealed from the loading platform, meaning that the supposed escape from Manhattan resulted in riders returning to where they started, also spoiling the ending for people waiting to ride. But this really is a minor gripe. And a ride that so heavily referenced a movie that was already 14 years old by this point was a bit of an odd choice. Alongside the likes of Jaws, Kongfrontation was promoted as one of Universal's key attractions in 1990, featuring prominently in advertising and occupying a prime spot within the park, ready to welcome the thousands of tourists such a major attraction would surely receive. However, the experience of many guests when it first opened did not go as smoothly as Universal would have hoped. Universal Studios' opening day was horrendous. Some attractions, like the show Alfred Hitchcock: The Art of Making Movies, and the simulator The Funtastic World of Hanna-Barbera, did operate smoothly. But across most of the park, rides were breaking down throughout the day, with some barely getting operational. E.T. Adventure suffered some breakdowns and a 2-hour wait when it was up and running. Earthquake, one of the 3 standalone versions of the Studio Tour attractions, didn't become fully functional until 2 in the afternoon. The hardest hit attraction was Jaws, which, as mentioned in my much older video on the history of that ride, was so beset by technical issues that not only did it not operate properly on June 7th, it would eventually close for a 3-year refurbishment to completely revamp the ride, also resulting in a lawsuit for one of the companies involved in its development. And as for Kongfrontation, its early issues were almost as bad, opening sporadically throughout the day, but spending much of it shut, with reporters and special guests being some of the very few people allowed to ride. The big technical issue with Kongfrontation, again according to Peter Alexander's same article, was that Universal had not yet been able to get the effect where Kong picked up the tram to synchronize properly. Of course, the animatronic was not actually picking up the ride vehicle. He was supposed to move his arms in sync with the ride system moving up and down, but the computer system that prevented the 2 objects from colliding still wasn't working. And so King Kong could sometimes get too close to the tram, causing a safety shutdown. The potential for the 37-foot tall, 13,000-pound animatronic to genuinely smack the ride vehicle, or a guest, was a huge safety concern. And so Peter Alexander chose to just monitor the synchronization manually, watching every ride vehicle, ready to shut things down if King Kong got too close. He also claimed to have personally selected who got to ride, picking people who seemed less likely to sue if they got injured, which does seem to me to be a bit of an exaggeration, but at least it goes to show how unready Universal were for opening. The park issued somewhere around 1,000 refunds to guests who attended the grand opening, and it was mocked in the press. Fortunately, unlike Jaws, Kongfrontation's major technical issues were fixed after a few months, and as the whole park worked to move past its poor first day, the ride quickly became one of its most popular attractions. Throughout the rest of the 90s, Universal Studios settled into its position as the prime competitor to Disney World in the Orlando tourism industry, and yet more attractions would be brought to the park based on movies like Back to the Future, Terminator 2, and Twister. Kongfrontation didn't experience a huge number of changes during this time. Sometime around 1991, the trough of water representing the East River was removed from the ride and replaced with a painted blue floor, as mold and algae had started growing in the stagnant pit. Later in the decade, the Texaco sponsorship came to an end, and the references to the company were removed. The only other notable change was that the advertising posters in the ride's queue were occasionally updated to include recent Universal movies, which didn't really fit with the ride's 1970s setting. In 1999, Universal opened its second park in Florida, Islands of Adventure. Alongside other spectacular attractions, Islands of Adventure brought with it the resort's first major roller coasters, the Incredible Hulk and Dueling Dragons. Universal Studios Florida did technically have a roller coaster of its own that opened that year, Woody Woodpecker's Nut House Coaster, but it was a family ride that didn't really stack up. And with the ever-changing landscape of Florida's theme parks requiring constant updates, perhaps it was thought that the original park could do with a roller coaster of its own. Universal's highest-grossing film of 1999 was The Mummy, a reboot of its classic monster movie that did already sort of feature in its parks. Its second highest-grossing film was Notting Hill, but I don't know if a Notting Hill roller coaster would really work. Universal's highest grossing film of 2001 was The Mummy Returns. And a year later, in 2002, Universal announced that after 12 years of operation, Kongfrontation would close to make way for what they promised would be a new mega attraction. They didn't actually say what it was going to be just yet, but the rumour mill at the time only offered one candidate for Kong's replacement. That's right, Notting Hill the ride, baby, let's go! Other than the desire for a new mega attraction, there was never an official reason given for Kongfrontation's closure. But maybe the 70s Kong aesthetic was finally getting a bit tired and outdated. Fans were understandably upset at its loss, but also realistic at it falling behind what was now open at Islands of Adventure. On September 8th, 2002, Kongfrontation had its final day of operation. To commemorate the closure of an opening day attraction, Universal held a closing ceremony in front of the ride during the evening, and pass holders received special invitations ahead of time, promising them exclusive ride time for Kong's final hours. They were also promised a special gift for attending. An estimated 9,000 pass holders showed up to ride Kongfrontation, crowding the entrance into the evening. The special gift they received was a King Kong plush. They were also handed bananas, not as a special gift, just for vibes. Just before the end of the day, at around 10, the final tram was loaded with pass holders for one last escape from Manhattan. And after they arrived, back in Manhattan, Kongfrontation closed for good. Over the next 2 years, the 6-story show building was transformed into Kong's replacement, opening on May 21st, 2004 as Revenge of the Mummy: The Ride. Notting Hill was unfortunately not meant to be. Revenge of the Mummy was the park's first major roller coaster, an indoor dark ride coaster hybrid, taking guests through a close encounter with the Universal monster. Still featuring spectacular special effects and animatronics, now modernised for the 21st century. The new ride saw the facade of Penn Station switched out for the entrance to the fictional Museum of Antiquities, and the subway station, city streets, and tram station became a walkthrough of props from the Mummy movies and a set of an ancient Egyptian tomb. A more detailed look at Revenge of the Mummy could perhaps be left for another time, but as far as its relation to Kongfrontation goes, guests arriving at the new ride could find some remnants of King Kong. The very first part of the queue maintained the original fake film set entrance, and while very hard to spot, in certain parts of the main roller coaster section, the original track from Kongfrontation could still be seen overhead. There were also some intentional Easter eggs left for guests to find too, like Kongfrontation coins hidden in the queue, a symbol throughout the queue that looks a lot like a gorilla, and most notably, a statue of King Kong in the treasure room scene on the ride. This would normally be the end of the story for a long-gone attraction like Kongfrontation. But this time, there are actually 2 more important moments that came after the opening of Revenge of the Mummy. In 2008, a massive fire broke out on the Universal backlot in Hollywood. It burnt 3 acres of sets, offices and sound stages, copies of films and TV shows, allegedly also some master tapes from Universal music recordings, and tragically destroyed King Kong Encounter. At that point, 22 years old, the attraction that had been so important for Universal's evolution into the theme park giant it now was, gone in the blaze. 2 years later, Universal would open a replacement for the burnt down attraction, a new King Kong segment on the tour named King Kong 360 3D. Based on the 2005 Peter Jackson version of the movie, it would ditch the New York streets for a wraparound video screen of Skull Island and a shaking platform underneath the tram, to place guests in the middle of a fight between Kong and the V-Rex from the movie. It was a serviceable replacement given the circumstances, but the move towards something exclusively screen-based did feel cheaper and less thoughtful than the original, and it had failed to replace the main part of the attraction in the first place, the giant animatronic of King Kong. Lastly, in 2016, back in Florida, the ride Skull Island Reign of Kong would open at Islands of Adventure, a dark ride taking guests on an expedition through Skull Island. The ride would stay true to Universal's now long history of building standalone versions of the studio tour attractions in Florida, as it would essentially be an expanded version of King Kong 360, using similar wraparound screens, but telling a slightly different story, and with a themed queue, show-building facade, and some animatronics to accentuate the experience. It wasn't the greatest addition to the park, as it still was essentially a journey through screens, but it did sort of make amends for the loss suffered in Hollywood, as the attraction would end with a reveal of a brand new giant animatronic of King Kong, even more lifelike than the ones on Kongfrontation, the most recent in Universal's legacy of King Kong attractions. Kongfrontation has been closed for more than 20 years, but it's still fondly remembered as one of Universal's best ever attractions, and I hope it's clear to see why. The massive scale and the spectacle of the ride's effects, particularly the two animatronics, as well as the detail of its themed sets, created what seemed to be a really exciting attraction. From a historical perspective, it was also an incredibly important ride to Universal theme parks as a whole, being the successor to the ride that was the whole reason why Universal resurrected their Florida plan in the first place. Revenge of the Mummy still operates today at the original Orlando park, and the Kong references are still visible, as does Reign of Kong at Islands of Adventure next door. I never got to experience Kongfrontation myself. I did experience King Kong 360 on the studio tour, although that does seem like it's the least significant of all the King Kong attractions. But everything I've seen and heard of Kongfrontation makes it a ride I think I really would have enjoyed. And while Revenge of the Mummy is a great ride that does a good job of creating a similar sense of threat and urgency, I feel if Kongfrontation was still around, despite its age, it would still be considered one of the best theme park attractions in Orlando, with maybe Notting Hill the ride in second. Let me know your thoughts about Kongfrontation, whether you rode it back in the day, if you've been on any other King Kong rides, or if you never experienced any of them. Let me know what you think. A big thank you to my Patreon members for supporting the channel. If you're looking for more videos to watch in between main channel uploads, my most recent video on Patreon was ranking my top 5 defunct theme park attractions I never got to experience from beyond the world of Disney parks. And without spoiling too much, I think you might be able to guess one of the rides that makes the list. If you're interested in joining the Patreon to get access to exclusive bonus videos every month, you can check out the link in the description. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this look back at Kongfrontation. If you're not already, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.